For days, dark storm clouds gathered across Kenya and much of East Africa as relentless rainfall battered cities, villages, and farmland without pause. Rivers began swelling far beyond their normal limits. Roads disappeared beneath rising floodwaters. Entire communities watched helplessly as the water crept closer hour after hour. Then, the situation spiraled into catastrophe. In the middle of the night, after another wave of torrential rain swept across the region, flood barriers failed and rivers burst from their banks with terrifying force. Walls of muddy water surged through towns and villages, sweeping away homes, vehicles, bridges, and entire families in minutes. This is the Kenya flood disaster, one of the deadliest and most destructive weather emergencies to strike East Africa in recent years. As of today, rescue operations are ongoing across multiple regions as officials struggle to respond to catastrophic flooding that has devastated communities throughout Kenya and neighbouring countries. Authorities say the death toll continues to climb as more bodies are recovered from submerged neighbourhoods, collapsed buildings, and riverbanks littered with debris. Thousands remain displaced, while many others are still missing after floodwaters tore through entire communities overnight. The hardest-hit areas include regions surrounding Nairobi, Garissa, Kisumu, and communities near the Tana River Basin, where the flooding reached catastrophic levels. In several locations, rivers expanded far beyond their natural boundaries, swallowing roads, farms, schools, and entire residential districts beneath fast-moving water. Residents described waking up to screams, collapsing structures, and the sound of raging water rushing through their streets. Some families escaped only moments before their homes were swept away. Others were forced to climb onto rooftops and trees as the floodwaters continued rising around them in complete darkness. One survivor described watching vehicles float down the street like pieces of paper as entire buildings began collapsing into the current. Another said the water rose so quickly there was no time to gather belongings or warn neighbours before the flooding engulfed the area. Videos emerging from the disaster zones show scenes of absolute devastation. Entire highways have disappeared underwater. Bridges have snapped apart under the pressure of violent currents. Homes sit partially submerged while survivors wade through chest-deep water, carrying children and whatever possessions they could save. In some regions, the flooding became so severe that entire villages were effectively cut off from the outside world. Roads leading into affected communities were destroyed or buried beneath mudslides, making rescue efforts extremely difficult. Emergency crews have been forced to rely on helicopters, military trucks, inflatable rescue boats, and even makeshift rafts to reach stranded residents. As daylight broke over the flooded regions, the true scale of the destruction began to emerge. Rescue teams moved through submerged streets searching for survivors trapped inside collapsed homes and overturned vehicles. Helicopters hovered above raging rivers as emergency personnel lowered ropes to civilians stranded on rooftops surrounded by floodwater. The conditions facing rescue workers remain extremely dangerous. Strong currents continue sweeping through urban areas, while additional rainfall threatens to trigger even more flooding and landslides in already devastated communities. Authorities deployed hundreds of emergency personnel, including military units, police, firefighters, and disaster response teams. But many areas remain inaccessible due to destroyed infrastructure and continuing storms. Medical teams established temporary treatment centres near evacuation shelters to care for injured survivors pulled from the floodwaters. Many arrived suffering from fractures, deep cuts, infections, hypothermia, and exhaustion after spending hours trapped in cold, contaminated water. Hospitals in several regions quickly became overwhelmed as ambulances continued arriving with injured residents. Doctors warned that the disaster could soon trigger additional health emergencies due to contaminated water supplies and overcrowded emergency shelters. Power outages and communication failures have made coordination even more difficult. Floodwaters damaged electrical grids, submerged substations, and knocked out cell towers across multiple regions, leaving entire communities isolated during the height of the emergency. In some areas, emergency responders were forced to rely entirely on radio systems and satellite phones as they searched through flooded neighborhoods for survivors. Families gathered near evacuation centers, desperately waiting for news about missing loved ones. Many stood silently in the rain holding photographs while rescue teams continued searching through debris fields and swollen rivers. Others waited inside overcrowded shelters where food, clean drinking water, blankets, and medical supplies were already beginning to run low. Authorities estimate that thousands of homes have either been destroyed or severely damaged by the flooding. Entire communities now sit underwater, covered in mud, debris and wreckage left behind by the violent currents. Satellite images released after the disaster show massive sections of land completely submerged beneath brown floodwater. Rivers that once carved narrow paths through the landscape have transformed into enormous inland seas stretching for miles across villages and farmland. Experts say the flooding was fueled by unusually intense rainfall linked to the East African rainy season, which has become increasingly unpredictable and severe in recent years. Meteorologists warn that climate change is contributing to stronger storms and more extreme rainfall events across the region. Warmer temperatures allow the atmosphere to hold more moisture, increasing the likelihood of sudden catastrophic downpours capable of overwhelming rivers and drainage systems within hours. Environmental experts also point to rapid urban expansion and poor drainage infrastructure as factors that worsen the disaster. In several cities, floodwater had nowhere to drain after storm systems overwhelmed aging infrastructure already struggling under growing populations. Deforestation and land degradation in some regions may have further increased runoff and soil instability, raising the risk of landslides and flash flooding after prolonged rainfall. Forecasts now warn that additional heavy rain could strike parts of Kenya and East Africa in the coming days, raising fears that the situation may deteriorate even further. Officials have issued evacuation orders for multiple high-risk areas, urging residents living near rivers and unstable hillsides to leave immediately. But for many families, evacuation means abandoning homes, livestock, businesses, and everything they own. As the storms continue, humanitarian organizations are racing to deliver emergency aid to displaced communities. Trucks carrying food, water, medicine and shelter supplies are moving toward affected regions, but damaged roads and continuing floods have slowed relief efforts significantly. Aid agencies warn that if conditions worsen, the disaster could evolve into a prolonged humanitarian crisis affecting hundreds of thousands of people across the region. As night falls once again across Kenya, rescue operations continue under floodlights and heavy rain. Boats move carefully through submerged neighborhoods while emergency crews search collapsed buildings and riverbanks for anyone still missing. The sound of helicopter blades echoes over flooded towns as rescuers continue pulling stranded residents from rooftops and isolated patches of land surrounded by water. For many survivors, the nightmare is far from over. Families who escaped the floodwaters now face uncertainty about whether they will ever be able to return home. Entire livelihoods have been wiped away overnight as farms, businesses, roads, schools and infrastructure lie buried beneath mud and debris. Children sleep inside crowded emergency shelters while parents search desperately for missing relatives. Communities that once stood intact now exist only as flooded ruins scattered across the landscape. Officials warn that the death toll may continue rising as rescue teams gain access to more isolated areas and floodwaters slowly begin to recede. But even after the rain eventually stops, the damage left behind by this disaster will remain for months and possibly years to come. The Kenya flood disaster is more than a single weather event. It is part of a growing pattern of increasingly destructive climate-related disasters impacting vulnerable communities across the globe. Each year, floods, storms, landslides, and extreme weather events are becoming more severe, more unpredictable, and more deadly. And for millions living in high-risk regions, disasters like this are no longer rare emergencies. They are becoming a terrifying reality of everyday life. Tonight, across Kenya and East Africa, families mourn loved ones lost to the floodwaters, survivors struggle to rebuild amid overwhelming destruction, and rescue workers continue racing against time, weather, and rising water levels in a desperate effort to save as many lives as possible. As the storms continue moving across the region, fears remain that even worse flooding could still be on the way. And for now, much of Kenya waits in darkness, uncertainty, and grief as the floodwaters continue to rise.